You are listening to an After Dinner Conversation magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we have created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Audiobooks, provides audiobook recordings of stories that have appeared in our magazine. And our companion podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kinds of discussions we hope you are having about these readings with friends, family, or students. We would love it if you would over to check it out. I'm Roberta, your narrator, and one of the acquisition editors at After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcasts and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/afterdinnerconversation. And of course, if you enjoy this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. Today's story is On Our Hands, written by Joanna Michal Hoyt and published in our April 2021 magazine. On Our Hands by Joanna Michal Hoyt. 10 months, 2 weeks, and 1 day ago, on a clear, cold day in late October, I set my plastic cup of cocoa down carefully on the Formica tabletop by the window of the Ready Stop, lowered myself to the bench, pulled off my windbreaker, and stuck my cane under the table where even I couldn't worry that anyone else would trip on it. Sadie Krebs picked her way gingerly down the Maple Street sidewalk, towed along by the humongous dog she had rescued. I told myself not to go apologize again for having possibly re-traumatized the dog by smacking across the muzzle the day before. I wouldn't have done that if I had seen it coming a ways away and had time to think. But I didn't have time. I was trying to pick up the book I had dropped, and the first thing I knew, its teeth were approaching me at eye level. Sadie knows I'm scared of dogs. After all these years, she probably also knows I'm scared of doing the wrong thing. And the fear sometimes pushes me into doing the wrong thing. Inside, Starla chatted up some kid I didn't know at the counter. Starla caught my eye over the kid's shoulder, and I gave a thumbs up to reassure her and myself that everything was okay. Then I hauled the laptop out of my backpack. Yes, at 70 I'm wandering around with a backpack like a high school kid. It's the best way I know to manage errands without a car and with a cane. I woke the screen up and let myself check my email. There was a message from my great-grandniece Sarah, headed, Aunt Gloria, I read your letter to the editor. And another from my great-nephew Alan, headed, Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Sarah and Alan, they're cousins, not brother and sister, don't write or speak to each other anymore, or even attend the same family gatherings. We used to complain about them heckling each other all through Thanksgiving dinner. Then in 2016, Sarah stormed out, leaving her turkey wing half-eaten, and didn't come back. And since then, they've taken turns showing up to all family events, which is not exactly a relief. I opened the newspaper, the real newspaper I'd bought from Starla along with my cocoa, not the web page, and read over my letter to the editor. They'd messed up the commas, but the words were still mine. I'd written, like most of the other people on the letter's page that day, about the race for county sheriff. We'd had Roland Granger for the past 20-some years. I didn't care much for his smarmy manners or his occasionally erratic grammar. But so far as I knew, there was nothing really important wrong with him. And anyway, he hadn't had much competition. But that year, Sam Pickett was running against him, promising to get tough on illegal aliens and not put up with our state's sanctuary policies. Pickett and Granger both had their main rallies in the other end of the county, where most of the money and the people are. But some of the local lackwits had decided to hold a Protect Real Americans rally, and the word was that Sam Pickett was going to grace it with his presence. There were 4 letters to the editor in favor of the rally. One was Allen's, which had a lot to say about protecting law-abiding Christian citizens from criminal aliens with blood on their hands. He did cite an actual nasty murder case involving a man who had entered the country without papers, but it wasn't even from our state. Not that we haven't had some nasty murders in state, but that's just been us native-borns doing each other in. There were 3 letters against the rally, in addition to mine. One was Sarah's, which had a lot to say about why we should be deporting asinine, sadistic Nazi picket supporters instead of migrants. I have not infrequently thought that some of my neighbors were asinine, but I don't know any sadists or Nazis among them. My letter said that undocumented immigrants were real and unthreatening human beings who took care of our old folks in the nursing homes and grew the food we ate, and that all of us, immigrants and native-borns, picket supporters and Granger supporters, were trying to do what we thought was right. I wasn't sure if it sounded humane and temperate by the contrast to the other letters, or just weak and mealy-mouthed. I opened my emails to get Alan's and Sarah's opinions. Sarah said she appreciated my trying to speak up. Trying. I'd spoken, I thought, for immigrants in the face of the massive fascist demonstration that was about to happen in town. But I needed to realize that if writing as if picket supporters were decent people who'd just gotten misinformed was exactly the sort of pseudo-neutrality that enabled the rise of the Nazis. She and her friends and fellow demonstrators were going to be standing up to that hate loudly and forcefully because the only alternative was. Oh, I could remember being as painfully earnest as Sarah, and I knew she had plenty to be pained in earnest about. But I couldn't ever remember being that certain of where all the right and all the wrong were. Nor did I think that calling Alan a Nazi was going to put him into a better frame of mind. And just what did she mean by forcefully, anyway? I stopped for a double take at her postscript. I hope Alan isn't pressuring you not to speak out more clearly. What kind of pressure did she have in mind? Blackmail? What could Alan tell anyone about me that they wouldn't already know? Threats? Of what? She must have known Alan wouldn't hit me or wouldn't stop patching my house up, however much my views annoyed him. He had some notion of chivalry, though it didn't extend to being polite to Sarah, and he remembered the hours I had spent wrangling algebra into his brain when he was younger. Alan's email said he thought it was great that I still stayed involved in civics. Still, did he mean even though I was an old lady and even though I was obsessive-compulsive? But that I needed to stop letting myself be brainwashed by the liberal media's lies about the immigrant invasion. He and the other patriots planning to assemble in the park were committed to protecting me and people like me from drug dealers and rapists, whether or not we appreciated it. I was always too concerned about the cracks in my brain to risk wedging them wider with drugs, so I didn't buy drugs. So I couldn't see how drug dealers were a threat to me. Anyhow, we already had 3 homegrown drug dealers, as Alan had some reason to know. Besides the fact, which I and one of the other letter writers had duly noted, that undocumented folks actually committed crimes other than crimes of crossing an imaginary line without a permit at lower rates than native-borns. But he'd already seen me pointing that out, and he just thought it showed I was brainwashed. He added a postscript too. 2 of them, actually. Hope the porch roofs stopped leaking. If not, tell me, and I'll try a better fix after we're done in the park. And if you wake up to what's going on, and Sarah tries to disown you like she did me, remember I'd be glad to take you to your knee appointments. The porch roof had indeed stopped leaking, and I was grateful for that, as for Sarah's taking me to the physical therapist, and for her telling me her troubles en route and listening as if I might, despite being old and crazy, know something worth knowing. Sarah and Alan probably couldn't help being idiots, any more than I could have helped it when I was 20-something. And they were both all hot and bothered because of the rally. I was hot and bothered too, but I knew enough to stay out of the crowd. Yes, the Protect Real Americans people were wrong, but they surely weren't going to change their minds because people waved signs and screamed slogans back at them. Anyhow, my having a panic attack in the middle of the crowd or losing my balance in the scrum and wrenching my knee replacement wouldn't help. I'd said what I had to say in the paper. An afternoon when the screaming was over, I'd invite Alan and Sarah to my place, one at a time, and try to get them to behave like sensible people. If they aren't in the hospital or in jail by then, said the nasty little voice in the back of my mind. Yes, in my mind. I don't have auditory hallucinations, but I do pay some attention to the things my brain says, for better or for worse. I figured this was worse. No sense panicking. I pulled out a blank note card and tried to compose a cheerful message to Sheila at the nursing home. Her family didn't want her taking visitors during flu season, and she got awfully lonesome, and sometimes letters cheered her up. But I didn't feel cheerful or even able to fake it convincingly. I pushed my card aside and opened Facebook. Sarah got me onto that, and I'm friends there, as they say, with her and Alan, too. I think they unfriended each other long ago. Alan had posted that he was ready to take action if thugs tried to deny their right to free speech, and that he'd be going live when the rally began. Sarah said she was a designated documenter in case of violent civil rights breaches by Nazis, that Nazis would be resisted to the utmost, and that she'd be going live when the rally began. Maybe they were both as crazy as I was. When Sarah and Alan went live, I was sitting there with my headphones on and staring into my little screen just like a teenager. Pickett was the first to speak at the gazebo, promising to uphold the law and keep the country great and uncorrupted by foreign criminals. Then he left, shaking hands in the crowd, a small crowd, not more than 100, as he went. Wallace Fremont, from the Chamber of Commerce, talked about American heritage and American values while Pickett was still working the crowd. Pickett was off-screen by the time Libby Saunders started yelling about the alien invasion. Then some creepy guy with a mustache who I couldn't place talked about protecting American women. I could hear Alan cheering his worst lines. The counter-demonstrators across the street from the park, about the same size crowd as the ralliers, got louder too as the rally went on. While Pickett talked, they were chanting, "No hate, no fear, immigrants are welcome here." I rather liked that. But by the time Libby stood, Sarah's folks were screaming, "Shame, shame," and "Deport the bigots." And when the next guy was up, several protesters shrieked, "You have blood on your hands," over and over. I couldn't see Alan's face to know if he thought they were quoting his letter. Sarah was one of the shriekers. Now and then, Sarah or Alan's video feeds would cut to the nervous-looking policemen lined up between the two groups. These ducked as things started flying back and forth across the street, then yelled at people to disperse. Then more police cars came in with sirens and lights, and people walked away or ran away, still shouting. Sarah pelted onto Maple Street along with a bunch of her friends, while Alan ran down Broad Street with his people. Broad intersected Maple, not a block from where I sat. The people around Alan and Sarah didn't seem to be calming down. I started to worry about them, and then to worry about what I was thinking of doing to stop them. And then I told myself I didn't have time to worry, I just needed to act. I hoiked my cane out from under the table, tottered over to the cooler, and bought 3 5-pound string bags of blood oranges from the Halloween special section. Starla ran over, helped me carry them to the counter, and bagged them in paper when I told her to. Then she turned her head, listening to the noise coming in the windows, the same yelling noise I had heard through my headphones. "Better sit down," she said. "I'll be fine," I told her. I snapped the plastic things off the end of the fruit bags and poured the oranges loose into the 2 paper bags she'd given me. Then I headed for the door. I should have put my coat on, but I didn't think I had time. "You don't want to go out there now," she started. "Yes, I do." "You'll be okay in here." "I won't be in here at all, Starla Mae Johnson. Don't you fuss at me." She looked at me, and then she looked again. Maybe she remembered me backing off Gussie's dog, that time the raccoon had bitten it. Sometimes it's handy being used to being terrified. "Let me get your coat." "No," I said. "Take that clever little phone of yours and film me crossing the road." "You'll fall. Let me go with you." "You stay here and film me," I said. I tottered down the steps, set the bags of fruit down on the stair behind me, then shifted round carefully and picked them up again. The handles I had to hold were still fine, but the bottoms of the bags were nice and damp. On my left, a scrum of people hustled down Maple Avenue. To my right, a pile of people shoved down Broad Street. Maybe they'd cross before Sarah's lot arrived, and it would be all fine. Or maybe not. The Broad Street line stopped moving and started yelling at the people on Maple Street. I shuffled out into the road, still shooting glances at both groups. Some people were trying to stay or back up, but other people were running toward each other, running fast and yelling. Even if I changed my mind and tried to get across the street before they met, it likely wouldn't work. The thing was to pick a good spot. The next thing I knew, my left foot slid on a wet spot, and my left leg shot right out from under me. My spot had picked me. I went down with my bad knee screaming, and I think my voice was screaming too. If I tried to tell you the next bit from my point of view, it would be very confusing and not very pleasant. I've been more or less sane, but I don't have sane language for the less sane times. I've seen Starla's film of the next bit, and it doesn't look so bad. This tottering old fool goes crashing down in the middle of the street, shrieking like a cat, with her tail in the door. Then the camera pans the street. People rush forward, waving signposts and flagpoles and yelling. Then they point at me. They're still yelling, but it sounds different. They're also not running as fast because there are blood oranges bouncing and slithering toward their feet. Then the camera's back on me, also on the big guy with the Confederate flag who is standing 6 feet from my right, holding the flagpole like a traffic barrier and yelling at his people to give the lady some space. And the scrawny bald-headed kid picking up oranges around his feet. And on the short brown-skinned guy kneeling at my left and speaking softly in my ear, then easing me into a sitting position. That was about when I started making sense of things again, when I didn't just want to scream or bite. So when the flag guy asked the man who was supporting me, "What are you doing to her?" I was able to say, "That's Asael Huerta from the nursing home. I see him sometimes when I go visit Sheila. He knows how to help me without making my back worse." Which was true. He was Sheila's favorite attendant. She liked his whistling, and except when they were short-staffed, which they too often were, she liked the way he slowed down and looked at her in the eye, and helped her feel like a person, not a defective package, as she said. She had a good mind, what was left of it, and a way with words, too. Asael wasn't whistling there on the wet street, but he sort of hummed a little in my ear in between asking me things about how I felt and what I could move, and the sound helped me get my mind steady again. The two groups of demonstrators had met by then, but the front runners from both sides were stuffing oranges into plastic bags someone had produced and telling me they'd carry them wherever I wanted them, which produced an atmosphere less than conducive to starting a free-for-all. And anyway, Asael had realized how bad my leg was and that I really couldn't get up just then. So if they had been going to fight, they would have had to do it somewhere else for fear of treading on me. And by the time the medics got through with the stretcher, Alan and Sarah were standing on either side of me, scolding me and telling me I'd be okay, or yelling at the people not to crowd around me. And by the time they loaded me into the ambulance, a lot of people had slunk off quietly. Not Asael. He waved to me. Alan and Sarah drove after me, both in Sarah's car, and God only knows what the conversation was like. And they stayed with me while my knee was set and iced and I was given my pills and discharged. Alan drove me home, and Sarah sat in the back seat with my head in her lap. I was disgusted with myself and them and everyone else by then. My knee was in agony, and I was sure I'd need another operation, and I'd die of it, and Alan and Sarah would blame each other, and they'd never speak to each other again, and it would be all my fault. I think I said as much, which I blame on the painkillers, because I have stupid ideas like that often enough, but generally keep them to myself. They sighed and scolded and soothed and choked out halfway polite things about each other just to shut me up. And then I fell asleep. That was a week before the election. The local news ran a piece on the rally and its aftermath. They used Starla's footage of the fall, and they talked to Starla about me. I guess they meant that for a kind of heartwarming ending, maybe a suggestion that folks should keep civil, whichever way the vote went. They got my mind problems in, as well as my knee, I suppose to explain why I was fool enough to decide to cross the street just then. Starla said some nice things about me, but she didn't say I'd set out to fall on purpose. Maybe she wasn't sure. Maybe she just thought it made a better story if it seemed like I'd done it by accident. That evening, on our town's Facebook page, not the official one that the Chamber of Commerce runs, but the gossip group where pretty much anything goes, had a link to the story with plenty of comments. Felix Mendel, who had been there shouting with Sarah's group, said that there might be some hope, even for some of the Nazis. And Libby Saunders said it was good to see that even some illegal aliens could find it in their hearts to be kind to old Americans. Sarah wasn't the only one who told Libby it was rude to call people aliens. No one argued about Asael's legal status, which didn't strike me as an important omission at the time. Libby told Felix that calling the Protect Real American Folks Nazis was disrespectful to the memory of Holocaust survivors. Felix told Doreen she had a lot of nerve telling the grandson of Holocaust survivors what he could and couldn't say about Nazis. I closed my laptop and went to bed. Alan took me to vote on the day of the referendum since Sarah was poll watching. Alan brought a wheelchair and insisted on pushing me in it. I was embarrassed, but also, before we had gotten one full block, relieved, since my knee still hurt. People asked me how I was doing, and I said, fine, thanks. And it wasn't completely false. Sadie Krebs leaned over to whisper in my ear, that was brilliant. And I didn't flinch when her mongrel stuck its drooling muzzle on my knee, though I couldn't quite bring myself to pat it. Sarah and Alan nodded to each other as Alan and I came through the line, and they managed not to say anything rude. I filled the circle next to Roland Granger's name with such emphasis that the pen went right through the paper and I had to request another ballot. Alan wheeled me back to the car and said, well, we've both done our civic duty and canceled each other out. I hated how smug he sounded about it. I hated even more the fact that he had clearly voted the wrong way. He had been quieter on Facebook since the rally, and I had hoped he had come to his senses. Apparently, a lot of people hadn't come to their senses. Sam Pickett got 52% of the vote. I saw his acceptance speech on a Facebook video. It was short and patriotic, and he didn't sound rabid, and I tried to tell myself he was probably decent at heart, and it was only 4 years. How much harm could he do? Then 3 months later, Sheila called me up from the nursing home to tell me that Asael was gone, and nobody would tell her why. She was in a stew about it. Well, Sheila was always a little nervy, and the dementia was starting to take her words and her sense of time away, so I wasn't sure whether he'd really disappeared or was on vacation. But I didn't altogether dismiss what she had said either. After all, I was crazy too, but more often than not, I was right about what was going on. I called Sheila's niece Abigail, who worked as a receptionist at the home, and it was true. Somebody had rear-ended Asael while he was driving home. He was fine, but his car was totaled, and when the police showed up, they asked for papers he didn't have. They arrested him. His wife called the home to ask if he was working late. Seems they didn't let him call anyone till the next day. She called the home again the next morning and said what had happened to him. She sounded frantic. Abigail could hear their 2-year-old yelling in the background. Abigail called St. Teresa's, where the Huertas go. They'd already gotten the news, and they were figuring out how to help Mrs. Huerta and the kids. The parents worked at different shifts, so someone was always home. Until, oh yes, Mrs. Huerta was a U.S. citizen, and so were the kids. A mercy. That's what Eunice from St. Teresa said. Both parents from the Reyes family had gotten arrested the week before because their car was past inspection and, well, they left 3 citizen kids behind. The oldest one 17. The immigration folks had set Mr. Huerta's bond at $5,000 and the Reyes parents at $7,000 each. Sarah had gotten word by then and was all over Facebook putting up the bond fund drive and the family fund drive, the petition, and also a post of her own that started, "Look what you did, you bastards," and tagged Alan, among others. Alan wasn't saying anything online. For once, I didn't suggest that Sarah go easier on him. I clicked over to the Huerta Bail Fund and I put in my $45. Yes, I know that's pathetic, but living on Social Security payments is no picnic when you've made no more than I did from a lifetime of working. I called myself stupid for putting anything in at all considering the bills I'd have to pay. I called myself selfish for not putting in more. I tried to distract myself from that by glancing down the list of donors. Alan's name was there. He'd put $300. Now, Alan's got a decent job for a young guy, but it wouldn't have been easy for him to spare that much. It wasn't until I felt my stomach unclench that I realized I'd been blaming myself for making Pickett supporters look like nicer people than they were, and so maybe making it easier for people to vote for them. Once I understood that, I told myself that my little bit of drama was hardly likely to have affected the vote. But at least Alan had noticed that Asael was a real human being, and he'd think again about his crazy ideas. I told myself that again when they made bond and Asael came home. I felt somewhat pressured when I heard that a lawyer had agreed to take his case pro bono and explain why it would be very dangerous for him to go home, where the gangs might not have forgotten that he had refused to work for or with them. I grinned like an idiot when I went to see Sheila and saw him. He smiled back at me, but it didn't quite reach his eyes, and Sheila said fretfully that he didn't whistle anymore. I didn't know what to tell myself 4 months ago when Asael went back for another hearing and they deported him, saying that reported death threats from a criminal gang did not meet the new standard for asylum. So even if Asael had applied properly and legally at the border instead of entering unauthorized, he would have been shipped back. I didn't know what to tell Alan this morning. I'd been expecting him to come over and fidget with my leaky hose spigot and take some of my extra tomatoes home with him. But when he got out of the car, he looked like death warmed over. I asked what was the matter, of course, and he just said, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant." He was a decent guy, and then he started crying, which seemed to embarrass him even more than the times I've cried on him. It took me a while to calm him down enough to get out of him that Asael Huerta was dead, throat cut, beaten up pretty badly first. Word got to his wife, who told the folks at church, who put the Huerta family on the prayer request list, which someone shared to the local Facebook group where Sarah saw it. Sarah called Alan and told him he was a murderer. I didn't know what to say. I knew who he had shouted for, who he had voted for, but he was Alan, and I had been comforting him in his upsets ever since he was 3 and found a dead robin in the driveway and couldn't understand what dead meant, how final it was. I told him I knew he had meant no harm, that I knew he was a decent guy, but that he had fallen in with the wrong people. "How can you say that?" he asked. "You saw how nice they were to you. Everyone saw that." How nice they were to me. I was as startled as Alan when I realized I was shrieking at him. How nice they were to me? So they pick up a crazy old lady's oranges and don't fight right on top of her? And you think that lets them off for telling disgusting lies about Asael Huerta? For getting him hauled away from his family and dumped in some place where people are trying to kill him? For getting him murdered? You think? Okay, Aunt Gloria, he started. Don't get all like Sarah. Don't okay me. She was right, you know, I said, breathing hard. You have blood on your hands, not just oranges. Alan gave me this awful dying dog look and walked out. He didn't slam the door. I would have felt better if he had. I started down the porch after him, but he was already rolling down the drive. I stared after him for a while and limped back in to think about what he had said. You saw how nice they were to you. Everybody saw that. If I hadn't staged my fall, if I hadn't made it into a hallmark moment, if the video feed had shown the Confederate flag guy hitting Sarah Would people have thought differently about Pickett and his people? Would they have voted another way? If it had shown Sarah kicking the flag guy while he was down, would that have moved the voters in the opposite direction? Do I have blood on my hands? Was I being melodramatic and anxious and irrational? Well, yes, of course. Did that mean there wasn't a real problem? No, not at all. I fussed about that until I was distracted by the stink of the kettle bottom burning. Seems it had run dry while I was watching Alan drive away. My niece, Alan's Aunt Kathy, who is also Sarah's aunt, not her mother, called me just half an hour ago. Alan had wrapped his pickup around the maple tree at the dogleg turn onto Falls Road. No, he wasn't dead, but he had broken his legs and some ribs, and he also had a concussion they were worried about. It seemed he had been drinking. Well, he liked beer on Saturday nights, but he wasn't mostly one to drink and drive. The phone's ringing again, and the stupid caller ID that Sarah insisted I get is telling me that it's Sarah calling me now. What am I supposed to say to her? Or to myself? I meant well when I tried to comfort Alan, and when I told him off, and when I stumped across the street between the marching lines. Sarah meant well when she told Alan what he had helped them do to Asael. God rest his soul, and God help his family. God forgive the rest of us. Alan meant well when he voted for Pickett. I'm fairly sure he actually did. God only knows what Pickett meant. God only knows if it matters. God only knows in this mess of a world how the hell we're supposed to love all the endangered people we brush against. How we're supposed to get out of this mess without any more blood on our hands. Now for the discussion questions. Number 1. What, if any, choices outside of a total change of opinions would have led to a better outcome for everyone? 2. Does a sovereign country have the right to limit who comes in and out of it? If it has that right, doesn't it also have the right to remove those who entered without permission? Then what, if anything, makes deporting Asael wrong? What, if any, reasons should allow persons who are in the country without permission to be allowed to stay? Number 3. Why do you think the two sides are so seemingly unable to find common ground? Are there certain topics where there simply is no common ground? If so, what are the underlying values of those various topics? Number 4. What, if anything, should the narrator have done differently in the story and why? And 5. Is reasonable debate still useful when there's no chance of the other side changing their mind, or even really listening and weighing the arguments? If that is so, then what use does debate serve? That was On Our Hands, written by Joanna Michal Hoyt. Next week, we'll be reading All Harriet's Pieces by A. Catherine Black. If you enjoyed this story, head over to our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, and listen to our discussions of this and other short stories from our magazine. We will include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage, in the comment section, or on our Facebook page. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.